There is something quietly remarkable about the open ocean at night. The water stretches in every direction, dark and vast, and above it, the sky holds more stars than most of us have ever taken the time to count. There is no road out here, no signpost, no landmark on the horizon. Just the slow rise and fall of the waves, the pull of the wind against the sail, and the endless, patient sea. And yet, over 1,000 years ago, people crossed it. Not once, not by accident, but repeatedly, deliberately, with purpose and with confidence. They sailed from the coastlines of Scandinavia out into the North Atlantic, one of the most demanding stretches of water on the planet. They found Iceland. They found Greenland. They reached the shores of North America, centuries before the voyages that history so often holds up as the great age of discovery. They went, and they came back, and they went again. These were the Vikings. And for a very long time, the question of how they managed it has quietly fascinated historians, archaeologists, and scientists alike. Because when you begin to look closely at what they had available to them, or rather, what they did not have, the achievement becomes more striking, not less. We tend to think of navigation as something that requires instruments. A compass to find north, a chart to understand position, a clock, perhaps, to calculate how far you have traveled. These are the tools that most people associate with finding your way at sea, and for good reason. They work. They are reliable. They give a navigator something solid to hold on to when the world around them offers nothing but water. But the Vikings did not have these things. The magnetic compass, which would eventually become one of the most essential tools in European seafaring, was simply not available in Western Europe during the Viking Age. It would not arrive for centuries. And so the men and women who launched longships into the North Atlantic and sailed them, successfully, across hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles of open water, did so without it. They had no compass. They had no detailed charts. They had no instruments of the kind we would recognize today as navigational tools. What they had instead was something harder to measure, and in some ways more impressive. They had observation. They had memory. They had an intimate, accumulated understanding of the natural world. The sky, the sea, the wind, the behaviour of birds and marine animals, and the subtle, shifting patterns that the environment laid out around them, for those who knew how to read it. This is the story of how they did it. It is not a dramatic story, in the way that battles or raids might be dramatic. There are no sharp edges here, no sudden moments of violence or glory. What there is instead is something quieter, and perhaps more enduring, the story of human attention, of what becomes possible when a people, over many generations, learn to pay very close, very careful attention to the world around them. The Vikings were not guessing when they crossed the North Atlantic. They were reading, and what they were reading was everything. The angle of the sun, the position of the stars, the color and temperature of the water beneath their hull, the direction from which certain winds arrived, the presence of particular birds far out at sea where no land should be visible. Every one of these things was a piece of information. And together, those pieces of information formed something that functioned, with remarkable reliability, as a map. Not a map drawn on parchment. A map held in the mind. Take a moment to imagine it, if you will. You are standing at the prow of a longship. The vessel is perhaps 20 meters long and lean and low in the water, built for speed rather than comfort. Around you, the crew moves quietly about their tasks. The sail is full. The ship is making good progress. And ahead of you, there is nothing. The sea goes on, and somewhere beyond the horizon, though the horizon gives no indication of this, offers no hint or clue, there is land. Iceland, perhaps, or the coast of Greenland, or the wild, wooded shores of a continent that no map in the known world has yet recorded. You know it is there, not because an instrument has told you so, but because the birds you have been watching for the past 2 days are beginning to fly in a particular direction in the evenings. Because the water has changed color in a way that you recognize. Because the wind has a quality to it that is consistent with what you were told, years ago, by an older sailor who had made this crossing before you. Because the stars last night sat at an angle above the horizon that told you, if you knew how to interpret it, that you were at roughly the latitude you needed to be. You know it is there, and you sail toward it. This is what Viking navigation was. Not magic, and not luck, though luck was always a factor at sea, as any sailor will tell you. It was a discipline, a body of knowledge, built up slowly over time, passed from one generation to the next, refined through experience and observation, and the hard lessons that the North Atlantic has always been willing to teach. It is a discipline that we have largely forgotten, because we no longer need it. Our instruments are so precise, our satellites so reliable, that the older forms of knowledge have quietly faded. But they were real. They worked. And the voyages they made possible were among the most extraordinary feats of human navigation in the ancient world. In the segments that follow, we will move through this story slowly and carefully. We will look at the tools and techniques that Viking navigators used, the natural cues they watched for, the instruments they may have carried, the knowledge they held in their minds and passed down through their communities. We will try to understand, as best we can, what it meant to navigate by observation alone, in one of the most demanding maritime environments on Earth. But for now, let this opening thought settle quietly. Over 1,000 years ago, human beings crossed the North Atlantic. They did it without a compass. They did it without charts. They did it through attention and knowledge, and a relationship with the natural world that was deeper and more fluent than most of us, today, can easily imagine. They looked at the sky, and the sea, and the birds and the wind, and they knew where they were going. That is where our story begins. This is what Viking navigation was. Not magic, and not luck, though luck was always a factor at sea, as any sailor will tell you. It was a discipline, a body of knowledge, built up slowly over time, passed from one generation to the next, refined through experience and observation, and the hard lessons that the North Atlantic has always been willing to teach. It is a discipline that we have largely forgotten, because we no longer need it. Our instruments are so precise, our satellites so reliable, that the older forms of knowledge have quietly faded. But they were real. They worked. And the voyages they made possible were among the most extraordinary feats of human navigation in the ancient world. In the segments that follow, we will move through this story slowly and carefully. We will look at the tools and techniques that Viking navigators used, the natural cues they watched for, the instruments they may have carried, the knowledge they held in their minds and passed down through their communities. We will try to understand, as best we can, what it meant to navigate by observation alone, in one of the most demanding maritime environments on Earth. But for now, let this opening thought settle quietly. Over 1,000 years ago, human beings crossed the North Atlantic. They did it without a compass. They did it without charts. They did it through attention and knowledge, and a relationship with the natural world that was deeper and more fluent than most of us, today, can easily imagine. They looked at the sky, and the sea, and the birds and the wind, and they knew where they were going. That is where our story begins. There is also the question of what we might call the systematic nature of Viking navigation. It would be a mistake to imagine Viking sailors simply casting off from shore and hoping for the best, reading whatever natural signs happened to present themselves and making do. The evidence suggests something much more deliberate than that. Viking navigation appears to have involved established routes, with known landmarks and waypoints. It involved deliberate choices about when to sail, what time of year, what conditions to look for, what to avoid. It involved preparation and planning, and the application of accumulated knowledge to the specific challenges of specific journeys. This is what skilled people do. They do not simply react to circumstances. They anticipate them. They plan for them. They bring knowledge to bear on a situation before that situation has fully developed, because experience has taught them what is coming. The Vikings, at their best, were doing exactly this. And while the details of their methods are sometimes lost to history, the oral traditions that carried so much of their navigational knowledge have not survived intact. Enough evidence remains, from sagas and archaeology and careful scientific analysis, to give us a meaningful picture of what their approach looked like. It is also worth saying something about the role of luck, because luck did play a part, and the Vikings would not have pretended otherwise. The sea is not a controlled environment. The North Atlantic in particular is a place of shifting weather, sudden storms, unexpected currents. Even the most skilled navigator, using every technique available to them, cannot guarantee a safe passage. History records Viking voyages that went wrong, ships lost, crews never heard from again, journeys that ended in disaster rather than landfall. But the important thing to understand is that skill and luck are not opposites. Skill does not eliminate the role of chance. What it does is shift the odds. A skilled navigator, with reliable methods and hard-earned knowledge, will cross the North Atlantic successfully far more often than someone simply hoping for the best. They will recognize danger earlier and respond to it more effectively. They will make better decisions under pressure. They will find land when a less experienced sailor would not. The fact that Viking navigation was not infallible does not mean it was not sophisticated. It means it was real, practiced by human beings, in a real and unpredictable world, where the best you can do is give yourself every possible advantage and face the rest with as much steadiness as you can manage. And that steadiness, too, was a kind of skill. There is something that experienced sailors develop, something that is difficult to teach directly, but that grows, almost inevitably, out of long exposure to the sea. A quality of calmness, of settled confidence, of being able to hold a course and trust your knowledge, even when the conditions around you are uncertain, even when you cannot see land and have no guarantee that you are exactly where you think you are. The Viking navigators who crossed the North Atlantic had that quality. They had earned it, and it was as much a part of their navigational ability as any technique or tool. As we move through the rest of this story, we will look in detail at the specific methods they used, the solar and stellar observations, the environmental cues, the possible instruments, the bodies of knowledge that shaped their understanding of the ocean. Each of these deserves careful attention. Each is, in its own way, a remarkable chapter in the history of human ingenuity. But all of it rests on this foundation, on the understanding that what the Vikings accomplished in the North Atlantic was not a mystery, and not a matter of luck. It was the product of real knowledge, real skill, and real effort, applied, steadily and intelligently, to one of the most demanding challenges that the natural world has ever presented to human beings. They were not guessing. They knew what they were doing. And in the segments ahead, we will begin to understand, in something of the same way that they understood it, exactly what that means. NS. On a clear day at sea, the sky is everything. There is no tree line to orient yourself by, no hill or church spire on the horizon, no road curving away in a direction that tells you something useful about where you are. The sea is, in that sense, a kind of blank, vast and largely featureless, offering very little in the way of the landmarks that land dwellers rely on almost without thinking. But look upward, and the picture changes entirely. The sky, on a clear day, is full of information. It has always been full of information, for those who know how to read it. Long before the Viking Age, seafaring peoples around the world had understood this, had looked up at the moving arc of the sun and recognized in it something reliable and useful. Something that, if you understood it well enough, could tell you where you were and which direction you needed to travel. The Vikings understood it very well indeed. Let us begin with the sun, because the sun was the most immediate and accessible navigational reference available to a sailor in the North Atlantic. On a clear day, and clear days, while not guaranteed, were common enough to be useful, the sun was simply there. Bright and unmistakable, moving in its slow arc across the sky, rising in the east and setting in the west, and reaching its highest point somewhere to the south. At its most basic, this gives you direction. East and west at the moments of rising and setting, south at the point of highest elevation during the day. For a sailor trying to hold a steady course, this is genuinely valuable. If you know which direction you need to travel, and the sun is in the sky, you have something to steer by. But the Vikings appear to have taken this further than the basics. Because the sun, watched carefully and understood properly, offers more than just a general sense of east, west, and south. It offers, to someone with the right knowledge, a way of estimating latitude, of understanding, at least approximately, how far north or south you are. The key to this lies in the sun's elevation. The angle at which the sun reaches its highest point in the sky each day, what navigators call solar noon, is not fixed. It changes depending on where you are in the world. The further north you travel, the lower the sun sits at its peak. The further south, the higher it climbs. This relationship between latitude and solar elevation is consistent and predictable. It follows rules, and those rules, once understood, can be applied. A navigator who has learned, through experience and instruction, what the midday sun should look like at a given latitude has a way of checking their position, of confirming that they are sailing at roughly the right distance from the pole, or of recognizing that they have drifted too far north or south and need to correct their course. This technique, sometimes called latitude sailing, was almost certainly part of the Viking navigational toolkit. It does not require precise instruments. It does not require mathematics in the formal sense. What it requires is accumulated knowledge, careful observation, and the ability to make sound judgments based on what you see, all of which the best Viking navigators possessed in abundance. But there is more to the story of the sun and Viking navigation, and it involves an object that has generated considerable scholarly interest over the years. Among the tools that Viking navigators may have used, and the word may is important here, because the evidence, while suggestive, is not without its uncertainties, is something that researchers have come to call the sun compass. The idea is not complicated. A sun compass, in its simplest form, is a disk, a flat, circular object, marked with lines or curves that allow a user to track the shadow cast by a central pin or gnomon as the sun moves across the sky. By reading the position of that shadow against the markings on the disk, a navigator could extract directional information, and potentially information about their latitude as well, depending on how the instrument was calibrated. Fragments of what appears to be such a device have been found in the archaeological record. A piece of a carved wooden disc, discovered at a Norse settlement in Greenland, has been interpreted by some researchers as a fragment of a sun compass. It is not a complete instrument, and not everyone is convinced that this is what it represents. But the interpretation is plausible, and fits well with what we know about Viking navigational practice more broadly. Whether or not the sun compass was widely used, the underlying principle, using the sun's shadow to extract navigational information, is sound. Researchers have built working reconstructions of such instruments and tested them under realistic conditions. The results suggest that a well-made sun compass, used by someone who understood it, could provide meaningful directional accuracy. Not the precision of a modern GPS, but something genuinely useful, enough to hold a course across open water, enough to recognize when you were drifting off track and needed to correct. It is also worth noting that such an instrument would have been relatively simple to make. It does not require sophisticated metallurgy or complex manufacturing. It requires a flat piece of material, wood, bone, or stone would all serve, a central pin, and careful calibration. The knowledge required to calibrate it properly is the harder part, but that knowledge was exactly the kind of thing that experienced navigators would have possessed and passed on. There is one condition, of course, under which none of this is useful. One condition that every sailor in the North Atlantic knows and respects, and that the Vikings would have encountered regularly on their long ocean crossings. Cloud. The sea is not silent. It does not announce itself the way a city does, with noise and light and the constant evidence of human activity. But it is not silent. It speaks, continuously, in a language made up of movement and color and temperature and the behavior of the living things that inhabit it. It has been speaking this language for as long as it has existed. And for most of human history, the people who lived beside it and depended on it learned, out of necessity, to understand at least some of what it was saying. The Vikings were among the most fluent readers of that language that the world has ever produced. This is not simply a romantic notion. It is a practical observation, grounded in what we know about how Viking navigation actually worked. The sky was important, the sun, the stars, the sunstone, the patterns of twilight. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the sky was only half of the picture. The other half was below the horizon, and below the hull, and in the water that surrounded the ship on every side. The ocean itself was a navigational instrument, and the Vikings knew how to use it. Begin with the waves. The open ocean is not a flat surface. It is a constantly moving, constantly changing three-dimensional environment, and the patterns of that movement carry information. Waves are not random. They are generated by wind, and they travel in directions determined by that wind, and they persist, carrying on in their original direction long after the wind that created them has shifted or died. This means that the swell patterns on the surface of the ocean reflect not just the current weather, but the weather of hours or days ago, in sometimes distant parts of the ocean. A navigator who understands this can read the swell, can feel, through the hull of the ship and through their own body, the dominant direction from which the waves are coming, can distinguish between the short, choppy waves generated by local wind and the long, deep swells that have traveled hundreds of miles from a distant weather system, can use these distinctions to extract directional information, to confirm a heading, or to recognize that the ship has been pushed off course by a cross-current during the night. This kind of wave reading is not abstract knowledge. It is physical, embodied knowledge, something you feel as much as you think. Experienced sailors develop a sensitivity to the motion of the ship beneath them, an awareness of the rhythms of the sea, that tells them things about their environment that they could not easily put into words. It is the kind of knowledge that accumulates in the body over years of time at sea, and that cannot be acquired any other way. The Vikings had it. They had spent their lives on and around the water, and the movement of the ocean under a ship was as familiar to them as the feel of the ground under their feet was to a farmer. Wind direction was another constant reference. The prevailing winds of the North Atlantic follow broadly consistent patterns, shifting with the seasons in ways that experienced sailors come to know well. A navigator who understood those patterns, who knew what direction a certain wind typically came from at a certain time of year, and what that meant for their position and heading, had access to a kind of background directional information that was available almost continuously, regardless of what the sky was doing. Wind direction is easy to feel. You do not need an instrument to tell you which way the wind is blowing. You feel it on your face and hands. You see it in the behaviour of the sail, the motion of the water's surface, the way spray moves. And a navigator who had spent years learning the character of the North Atlantic winds would have developed an intuitive understanding of what a given wind direction suggested about where they were and where they were going. This is not precision navigation, but it is a steady, reliable background reference, a constant thread of information woven through every moment of a passage, available to be consulted whenever the more precise celestial methods were temporarily unavailable. Above the water, but still part of the ocean's language, were the clouds. Not all clouds are the same, and not all clouds mean the same thing. Sailors have always known this, have always watched the sky not just for the sun and stars, but for the clouds themselves, reading their shapes and movements and colors for information about weather and wind, and, in some cases, about the land beneath them. Because some clouds form over land in ways that distinguish them from clouds that form over open water. When warm, moist air rises over an island or a coastline, it can produce cloud formations that sit in roughly the same position day after day, stationary in a way that ocean clouds are not. Experienced sailors, approaching a landmass that was still below the horizon, could sometimes see the telltale cloud sitting above it, a fixed, distinctive shape against an otherwise moving sky, and know that land was near before any other evidence confirmed it. This was not a technique that worked in all conditions, or at all times of year, but it was real, and it was used, and it represents something important about the nature of Viking environmental navigation, the way in which every feature of the natural world was potentially a source of useful information, if you knew what to look for. The North Atlantic is not always clear. In fact, for significant portions of the sailing season, overcast skies are more common than clear ones. Fog rolls in from the cold water. Storm clouds build on the horizon and move in faster than you might expect. Days pass, sometimes many days, when the sun is simply not visible, when the sky above you is a uniform grey and there is no shadow to read, no arc to follow, no solar reference of any kind. On those days, the sun compass was useless. The solar techniques that served so well in clear conditions offered nothing. And yet the Vikings kept sailing. They did not stop and wait for the sun to reappear. They continued to navigate, continued to make progress, continued to find their way. Which tells us that solar navigation, as impressive as it was only part of the picture. At night, the sky offered something different. The stars. For a navigator who understood them, the stars were not simply points of light scattered randomly across a dark sky. They were a map, fixed in their relative positions, rising and setting in consistent patterns, moving through the night in arcs that were predictable and readable. A navigator who knew the stars could look up at a clear night sky and extract from it a remarkable amount of useful information. The most immediately useful of the stars, for a navigator in the Northern Hemisphere, is the one that appears to hold still while all the others move. The one that sits directly above the North Pole, around which the rest of the night sky seems to rotate as the hours pass. We know it today as the North Star, or Polaris. The Vikings called it the lodestar, the guiding star, and for good reason. It does not rise and set like the other stars. It does not travel across the sky. It simply sits there, steady and reliable, pointing north with an accuracy that no other natural phenomenon quite matches. For a Viking navigator trying to hold a northerly or southerly course, which, given the geography of the North Atlantic routes, was often exactly what was required, Polaris was invaluable. As long as the sky was clear, it told you, without ambiguity, where north was. And if you knew where north was, you knew where every other direction was as well. But Polaris offered something beyond simple direction. It offered, once again, a way of estimating latitude. The height of Polaris above the horizon, the angle it makes with the sea, is directly related to your position on the Earth. At the North Pole, Polaris sits directly overhead at 90 degrees. At the equator, it sits on the horizon at 0 degrees. And at every latitude in between, it sits at an angle that corresponds precisely to that latitude. This means that a navigator who has learned to judge the elevation of Polaris, not with precise instruments, but with practiced eyes and simple tools, has access to latitude information even in the darkness of night. They can tell, with reasonable accuracy, whether they are at the right distance from the pole for their intended route, and adjust accordingly. The Norse sagas offer occasional glimpses of this understanding at work. There are references, sometimes oblique and sometimes more direct, to navigators using the stars to guide their passage. The language is not always technical. These were stories told for audiences who did not need to be taught the details of navigation, who already understood, in a general way, how it worked. But the references are there, and they are consistent with what the physical evidence and scientific analysis suggest about how Viking navigation actually functioned. Beyond Polaris, there were other stars and star patterns that would have been useful to an experienced navigator. The rising and setting points of certain bright stars can serve as directional references in the same way that the sun's rising and setting do. The overall pattern of the night sky shifts over the course of the night in ways that a knowledgeable observer can use to track time and direction simultaneously. The sky, to someone who had spent years learning to read it, was dense with information. It was, in a very real sense, the Viking navigator's primary instrument. There is something worth sitting with here, before we move on. We live in an era of artificial light. For most people in the modern world, the night sky is something encountered only occasionally, on camping trips, perhaps, or in rural places far from city centers. The stars are there, but they are dimmed by the glow of streetlights and buildings, and most of us have never learned to read them in any meaningful way. They are beautiful, but they are not, for us, useful in the practical sense that they were for earlier generations. For a Viking navigator on the open Atlantic, the night sky was something else entirely. It was a working tool, consulted every clear night as a matter of course. It was something they had grown up watching, had been taught to read by people who had spent their own lives doing the same, had come to know with the kind of easy familiarity that only long acquaintance produces. The stars were not mysterious to them. They were known. They were reliable. And in the darkness of the North Atlantic, with nothing but water in every direction and no other point of reference available, they were home. Sun by day, stars by night. Two great lights in the sky, each offering, to eyes trained to see it, a wealth of directional and positional information. Together, they formed the backbone of Viking celestial navigation, the primary framework within which all the other techniques and cues took their place. In the segments ahead, we will look at those other techniques. The ways in which the Vikings read not just the sky, but the sea itself, the water, the birds, the currents, the wind. All the ways in which the natural world, understood deeply enough, becomes a kind of language that tells you where you are and where you need to go. But for now, let the sky hold your attention for a moment longer. The slow arc of the sun across a clear Atlantic day. The steady, silent point of the North Star in the darkness above a ship making way through the night. They were always there, and the Vikings knew how to listen to them. Sun by day, stars by night. Two great lights in the sky, each offering, to eyes trained to see it, a wealth of directional and positional information. Together, they formed the backbone of Viking celestial navigation, the primary framework within which all the other techniques and cues took their place. In the segments ahead, we will look at those other techniques. The ways in which the Vikings read not just the sky, but the sea itself, the water, the birds, the currents, the wind. All the ways in which the natural world, understood deeply enough, becomes a kind of language that tells you where you are and where you need to go. But for now, let the sky hold your attention for a moment longer. The slow arc of the sun across a clear Atlantic day. The steady, silent point of the North Star in the darkness above a ship making way through the night. They were always there, and the Vikings knew how to listen to them. The North Atlantic does not owe you good weather. Any sailor who has spent time on those waters knows this. The sea there has a temperament of its own, shifting, unpredictable, capable of delivering days of extraordinary clarity and beauty and then, without much warning, pulling a grey curtain across the sky and holding it there for as long as it pleases. Fog settles on the water like something alive. Cloud systems move in from the west, broad and thick, swallowing the horizon, and then the sky above it until there is no blue left anywhere, and the world reduces itself to a vessel, a crew, and a uniform grey that offers nothing in the way of celestial reference. For a navigator who depended on the sun, this was the central problem. Not an occasional inconvenience, but a recurring and serious challenge. One that the Vikings faced on virtually every long ocean crossing, and one that they could not simply wait out. Time mattered at sea. Provisions were finite. Currents and winds moved a ship, whether you wanted them to or not. Stopping was not an option. You had to keep sailing, and you had to keep navigating, even when the sky gave you nothing to work with. The question is how they managed it. And the answer, it turns out, is more interesting than most people expect. Among the most intriguing possibilities in the history of Viking navigation is an object referred to in a small number of Old Norse sources as a solstein, a sunstone. The references are brief, and they have been debated by historians for decades. In one saga, a sunstone is consulted by a navigator on an overcast day to determine the position of the sun. The detail is mentioned almost in passing, without explanation, which suggests that the original audience would have understood what was meant, that the sunstone was a known enough object that it required no elaboration. But for modern readers, the reference raises an obvious question. What was it? The leading candidate, supported by a significant and growing body of scientific research, is a naturally occurring crystal known as Iceland spar. The name alone is suggestive. Iceland spar is a form of calcite found in abundance in Iceland, which sat at the very heart of the Viking North Atlantic world. It is a clear, transparent mineral, colorless and glassy in appearance, and it possesses a property that sets it apart from most other transparent materials. It polarizes light. Light, when it travels through open air, vibrates in all directions simultaneously. But when sunlight enters the atmosphere and is scattered by the air and moisture it encounters, something changes. The scattered light becomes polarized. It vibrates predominantly in one direction rather than all directions equally. This polarization follows a consistent pattern, organized in arcs across the sky relative to the position of the sun. And crucially, this pattern is present even when the sun itself is not visible. Even on an overcast day, the scattered light filtering down through the clouds carries within it this polarization signature. Fainter than on a clear day, but there. Human eyes cannot detect polarized light directly. We do not have the biological equipment for it. But Iceland spar can. When you hold a crystal of Iceland spar and rotate it while looking through it at the sky, the amount of light it transmits changes. It brightens and darkens as you turn it, and the pattern of that brightening and darkening is directly related to the direction of polarization of the light coming through. By finding the orientation at which the crystal transmits the most light, or transitions between bright and dark in a specific way, a careful observer can identify the direction of the sky's polarization pattern, and from that, work back to where the sun must be sitting behind the clouds. It sounds almost too elegant to be practical, but researchers have tested it. They have taken Iceland spar crystals onto the water, under overcast skies, and used them to locate the sun's position. The results have been, by the standards of the available technology, surprisingly accurate. Under good conditions, skilled users have been able to identify the sun's azimuth, its compass bearing, to within a few degrees. A few degrees is not perfection. But at sea, in the context of latitude sailing and long ocean crossings, a few degrees is more than workable. It is the difference between navigating and being lost. A fragment of what may be an Iceland spar crystal was discovered among the wreck of an Elizabethan-era ship. Later than the Viking Age, but consistent with the idea that such crystals were carried aboard vessels as navigational tools across a broad span of maritime history. The fragment was found alongside other navigational instruments, which adds weight to the interpretation. And while direct archaeological evidence from Viking contexts remains limited, the scientific plausibility of the sunstone theory has strengthened considerably over the years as the physics has been more carefully worked out and the practical tests have been conducted. The sunstone, in short, is no longer simply a curiosity from an old saga. It is a credible piece of navigational technology, one that fits neatly into the broader picture of Viking navigational practice as a sophisticated, multi-layered system designed to function, even when conditions made simpler methods unavailable. But the sunstone was not the only resource available to a Viking navigator on an overcast day. There were subtler things, environmental cues that required no instrument at all, only trained eyes and a deep familiarity with the way light behaves in the world. One of these involved the behaviour of the sun's light, even when the sun itself was below the horizon or obscured by cloud. Around the middle of the day, when the sun is at its highest and its light is falling most steeply onto the surface of the sea, the shadows cast by objects on board, a mast, a raised hand, the edge of a sail, still carry directional information. The shadow falls away from the sun. Even diffuse cloud cover, which scatters light and softens shadows significantly, does not always eliminate this effect entirely. A navigator paying careful attention, looking for the faintest trace of shadow directionality, might extract something useful even from a heavily overcast midday sky. It is a subtle technique. It requires patience and attentiveness, and it would not have worked in all conditions. But it is precisely the kind of thing that an experienced sailor, someone who had spent years learning to notice the things that less experienced eyes would pass over, would have known to look for. More reliable, perhaps, were the patterns of twilight. At the moments of sunrise and sunset, even on days when the sun itself never quite breaks through the cloud, the sky behaves in distinctive ways. The light changes. Colors shift. There is a brightening in the east before dawn, a lingering warmth in the west after the sun has dipped below the horizon. These twilight phenomena are not eliminated by cloud cover in the way that direct sunlight is. They persist, diffused and softened perhaps, but present. A navigator who knew what to look for could use these patterns to establish east and west with a reasonable degree of confidence, even on days when the sun was never properly visible. The timing of the brightening, the direction from which the light seemed to be growing, the color of the sky at its brightest point, all of these things offered information, if you knew how to read them. And knowing how to read them was, again, a matter of experience, of having watched enough sunrises and sunsets, in enough different conditions, to have built up an internal library of what these things looked like and what they meant. This kind of knowledge cannot be fully written down. It lives in the body and the eye, accumulated through years of attention. Then there is something more subtle still. Something that sits at the edge of what we would normally think of as navigation, and that touches on questions of perception and awareness that are genuinely fascinating. The sky, even on an overcast day, is not uniform. The polarization of scattered light, the same phenomenon that makes the sunstone useful, produces patterns in the sky that shift and change with the position of the sun. These patterns are invisible to the unaided human eye, and yet they are there, encoded in the light that reaches us from every part of the sky. There is evidence, tentative and subject to ongoing debate, that some animals can perceive polarized light directly. Certain insects navigate by it. Some birds appear to use it as part of their orientation system. Whether human beings have any residual sensitivity to polarized light is a question that researchers have explored without reaching a firm consensus. The evidence is mixed and the effects, if they exist, are small. But what is more clearly established is that the patterns of skylight polarization are, in principle, readable by any observer who has the right tools, including, as we have seen, Iceland's spar. A navigator equipped with a sunstone was not just using it as a direct pointer to the sun's position. They were, in a sense, reading the broader pattern of the sky's polarization, using the crystal as an interface between that pattern and the human eye. The sky, in other words, was always carrying information. Even when it appeared to offer nothing, grey and flat and featureless, there was a structure to its light that a knowledgeable navigator, with the right tools and the right understanding, could begin to decode. What emerges from all of this is a picture of Viking navigation as something remarkably adaptive. It was not a single technique, dependent on ideal conditions and useless when those conditions failed. It was a system, layered and flexible, with multiple methods available at any given moment, each one suited to slightly different circumstances, each one capable of filling in for the others when conditions made them temporarily unavailable. Clear sky. Use the sun directly. Read its arc, its elevation at midday, the shadows it casts. At night, turn to the stars. Overcast? Reach for the sunstone. Hold it to the sky and rotate it slowly, reading the brightening and darkening until you find the sun's direction behind the cloud. Watch the horizon at dawn and dusk for the traces of twilight. Read the faint shadows at midday. Look at the sky with attention, because even a grey sky is not an empty sky. Deeper into the night, into the fog, into conditions where the sky offers nothing at all. Then you turn to other things, the sea itself, the wind, the birds, the current. The natural world does not run out of information. It only requires you to look for it in different places. There is something quietly admirable about this. Not admirable in a showy sense. There is nothing dramatic about a man holding a crystal up to a cloudy sky and rotating it slowly, watching for a shift in brightness. It is a patient, careful, unhurried act. An act of attention rather than action. But it represents something important. It represents the refusal to be defeated by circumstances. The understanding that even when the most obvious tools are taken away, there are still resources available, still information to be found, still ways to keep moving forward. The Vikings did not stop navigating when the sky clouded over. They adapted. They reached into a deeper layer of their knowledge and pulled out something that most modern people, certainly, would not even have known to look for. And they kept sailing. In the next segment, we will move our attention from the sky to the sea itself. Because the ocean, it turns out, had its own language, its own ways of communicating information about depth and current and direction, and the presence of land to those who knew how to listen to it. But for now, let this idea rest quietly. The overcast sky above a Viking longship, grey and apparently empty. And somewhere up there, behind the clouds, the sun, its position encoded in the polarization of the scattered light, readable, if you know how, through a simple crystal of Iceland's spar. The sky was never truly blank. Not to those who knew how to look. The sea is not silent. It does not announce itself the way a city does, with noise and light and the constant evidence of human activity. But it is not silent. It speaks, continuously, in a language made up of movement and color and temperature and the behavior of the living things that inhabit it. It has been speaking this language for as long as it has existed. And for most of human history, the people who lived beside it and depended on it learned, out of necessity, to understand at least some of what it was saying. The Vikings were among the most fluent readers of that language that the world has ever produced. This is not simply a romantic notion. It is a practical observation, grounded in what we know about how Viking navigation actually worked. The sky was important, the sun, the stars, the sunstone, the patterns of twilight. All of that was real, and all of it mattered. But the sky was only half of the picture. The other half was below the horizon, and below the hull, and in the water that surrounded the ship on every side. The ocean itself was a navigational instrument, and the Vikings knew how to use it. Begin with the waves. The open ocean is not a flat surface. It is a constantly moving, constantly changing three-dimensional environment, and the patterns of that movement carry information. Waves are not random. They are generated by wind, and they travel in directions determined by that wind, and they persist, carrying on in their original direction long after the wind that created them has shifted or died. This means that the swell patterns on the surface of the ocean reflect not just the current weather, but the weather of hours or days ago, in sometimes distant parts of the ocean. A navigator who understands this can read the swell, can feel, through the hull of the ship and through their own body, the dominant direction from which the waves are coming, can distinguish between the short, choppy waves generated by local wind and the long, deep swells that have traveled hundreds of miles from a distant weather system, can use these distinctions to extract directional information, to confirm a heading, or to recognize that the ship has been pushed off course by a cross-current during the night. This kind of wave reading is not abstract knowledge. It is physical, embodied knowledge, something you feel as much as you think. Experienced sailors develop a sensitivity to the motion of the ship beneath them, an awareness of the rhythms of the sea, that tells them things about their environment that they could not easily put into words. It is the kind of knowledge that accumulates in the body over years of time at sea, and that cannot be acquired any other way. The Vikings had it. They had spent their lives on and around the water, and the movement of the ocean under a ship was as familiar to them as the feel of the ground under their feet was to a farmer. Wind direction was another constant reference. The prevailing winds of the North Atlantic follow broadly consistent patterns, shifting with the seasons in ways that experienced sailors come to know well. A navigator who understood those patterns, who knew what direction a certain wind typically came from at a certain time of year, and what that meant for their position and heading, had access to a kind of background directional information that was available almost continuously, regardless of what the sky was doing. Wind direction is easy to feel. You do not need an instrument to tell you which way the wind is blowing. You feel it on your face and hands. You see it in the behavior of the sail, the motion of the water's surface, the way spray moves. And a navigator who had spent years learning the character of the North Atlantic winds would have developed an intuitive understanding of what a given wind direction suggested about where they were and where they were going. This is not precision navigation, but it is a steady, reliable background reference, a constant thread of information woven through every moment of a passage, available to be consulted whenever the more precise celestial methods were temporarily unavailable. Above the water, but still part of the ocean's language, were the clouds. Not all clouds are the same, and not all clouds mean the same thing. Sailors have always known this, have always watched the sky not just for the sun and stars, but for the clouds themselves, reading their shapes and movements and colors for information about weather and wind, and, in some cases, about the land beneath them. Because some clouds form over land in ways that distinguish them from clouds that form over open water. When warm, moist air rises over an island or a coastline, it can produce cloud formations that sit in roughly the same position day after day, stationary in a way that ocean clouds are not. Experienced sailors, approaching a landmass that was still below the horizon, could sometimes see the telltale cloud sitting above it, a fixed, distinctive shape against an otherwise moving sky, and know that land was near before any other evidence confirmed it. This was not a technique that worked in all conditions, or at all times of year, but it was real, and it was used, and it represents something important about the nature of Viking environmental navigation, the way in which every feature of the natural world was potentially a source of useful information, if you knew what to look for. The sea itself, below the surface, was readable in its own ways. The color of ocean water is not uniform. It changes with depth, with temperature, with the concentration of plankton and other organic material, with proximity to coastlines and river mouths, and the particular characteristics of different ocean regions. Open ocean water, far from land, tends to be a deep, clear blue, the color of depth and clarity, of water that is old and cold and largely undisturbed. But as you approach shallow areas, as you move over submerged banks or into the waters near a coast, the color shifts. Greens appear. Browns. The water becomes less transparent, more turbid, richer in the organic life that flourishes in shallower, more nutrient-rich environments. A navigator watching the water over the side of a ship could read these color changes as information about what lay below. A shift from deep blue to green might signal that the bottom was rising, that a bank was nearby, or a coastline approaching. The specific colors and their meanings would vary from one region to another, and the ability to read them accurately was a product of local knowledge, of familiarity with particular waters built up over many crossings. But the basic principle was available everywhere. The sea was telling you something about its own geography, if you cared to look. Temperature was another cue, though one that required direct physical contact rather than observation. Different bodies of water in the North Atlantic have different temperatures, reflecting their origins and their histories. Cold currents carry water south from the Arctic. Warmer currents carry water north from lower latitudes. The boundaries between these currents, the places where cold water meets warmer water, are sometimes detectable by feel. A hand trailing in the water, or the spray on your face, or simply the feel of the air above the water, which is influenced by the temperature of the sea below. These thermal cues are subtle. They are not the kind of thing that a novice sailor would notice or know how to interpret. But to someone with deep familiarity with particular stretches of ocean, they were real and useful. Another thread in the complex web of environmental information that an experienced navigator was continuously processing. Then there were the birds. If there is one environmental cue that comes up most consistently in discussions of traditional ocean navigation, not just Viking navigation, but the navigation of seafaring peoples around the world, it is the behavior of seabirds. And there is good reason for that consistency. Birds are excellent indicators of land, and experienced sailors learn to read their behavior with considerable precision. The basic principle is well established. Many seabirds, while capable of ranging far out over the open ocean, return to land to roost at night. This means that in the late afternoon and early evening, birds that have been feeding at sea begin to fly toward land. The direction of that flight is directional information. A navigator who notices birds flying purposefully in a consistent direction as evening approaches has a reasonable basis for concluding that land lies in that direction. Different species offered different kinds of information. Some seabirds range further from shore than others, which means that the species present at any given moment told you something about how far from land you were likely to be. Certain birds were associated with specific islands or coastlines, their presence a suggestion that those particular landmasses were not far away. The abundance of birds, the sheer number of them, the density of the flocks, also carried meaning, increasing as you moved into the productive waters near land. Viking sailors would have known all of this. They would have grown up around seabirds, would have learned their habits and ranges from childhood, would have developed the kind of easy familiarity with avian behaviour that allowed them to read it almost without thinking. A shift in the birds around the ship was not background noise. It was signal. Migration added another layer to this. Many bird species migrate seasonally, moving between northern breeding grounds and southern wintering areas along routes that cross the North Atlantic. A navigator who understood these migration patterns could extract positional information from the presence of certain species at certain times of year, could use the birds themselves as a kind of seasonal clock, confirming that they were in the right region at the right time. This is sophisticated environmental knowledge. It requires not just familiarity with individual species, but an understanding of their annual cycles, their routes, their timing. It is the kind of knowledge that accumulates over generations, that is built into a maritime culture's understanding of the world, and that is passed on as naturally and as carefully as any other practical skill. Beyond the birds, there are the larger inhabitants of the ocean. Some scholars have suggested that Viking navigators may have paid attention to the behaviour of whales and other marine mammals as navigational cues. Whales are not randomly distributed across the ocean. Different species favour different habitats, particular depths, temperatures, and productivity levels, and their presence in a given area can reflect the underlying oceanographic character of that region. A navigator who knew which species lived in which kinds of waters, and who encountered a particular species they recognized, might draw conclusions about their position from that encounter. The evidence for this is less direct than for some of the other techniques we have discussed. It rests more on inference and on comparison with other traditional maritime cultures that are known to have used such cues, than on specific historical documentation from the Viking Age. But it is consistent with the broader pattern of Viking environmental awareness, the idea that everything in the natural world was potentially informative, and that a skilled navigator was alert to all of it. Currents, too, were part of the picture. The North Atlantic has major current systems that move large volumes of water in consistent directions. The Gulf Stream carries warm water northeastward from the western Atlantic. Cold currents flow southward along the eastern coast of Greenland. These currents affect not just the temperature of the water, but its color, its surface texture, and the distribution of the marine life within it. And they have characteristic effects on a ship, subtle forces that push a vessel off its intended course if the navigator is not accounting for them. An experienced navigator would have known where the major currents were, and what they meant for a ship's actual track through the water. They would have been alert to the signs of entering or leaving a current. The change in water color, the shift in temperature, perhaps a subtle change in the motion of the ship. And they would have incorporated this awareness into their ongoing mental calculation of where they were and where they were going. What all of this adds up to is something quite remarkable. A Viking navigator on the open North Atlantic was not simply steering a ship. They were engaged in a continuous act of environmental reading, processing, almost constantly, a stream of information drawn from the sky above and the sea below, and everything that moved through that space around them. Wind and wave and swell, and cloud and color, and bird and current and creature, all of it feeding into an ongoing, dynamic understanding of position and heading and the character of the water they were moving through. None of it, taken alone, was infallible. Any single cue could mislead. Birds could fly in unexpected directions. Currents could behave anomalously. Clouds could form or dissipate in ways that were not representative of the usual pattern. The skill lay not in any one technique, but in the synthesis, in the ability to hold all of these threads simultaneously, to weight them against each other, to notice when they were consistent and when they were contradictory, and to make sound judgments from the whole picture rather than any individual part. This is what experienced navigators did. Not consciously, step by step, as a formal calculation, but fluidly, naturally, as an expression of deep familiarity with the environment they were moving through. The ocean spoke, and they listened, not to any single voice, but to the full chorus. There is a kind of attention that this requires, a sustained, quiet, open attentiveness to the world, that is very different from the focused, instrument-directed attention of modern navigation. It is closer, perhaps, to what we might call presence, a continuous awareness of everything around you, held lightly and openly, so that nothing significant passes unnoticed. It is not a common mode of attention in the modern world. We are trained, these days, to focus narrowly, to look at screens, to follow instructions, to direct our awareness towards specific tasks and filter out the rest. The broad, environmental attentiveness that Viking navigators cultivated is something most of us have to make a deliberate effort to practice. But it was, for them, simply how you moved through the world at sea. Simply what it meant to pay attention. In the next segment, we will look at the routes themselves, the specific paths that Viking navigators took across the North Atlantic, and the way that knowledge of those routes was organized, remembered, and passed on. Because all the environmental awareness in the world is more useful when it is combined with a clear understanding of where you are trying to go, and what you should expect to find along the way. For now, though, let the ocean settle around you. The slow, deep roll of a North Atlantic swell. The color of the water shifting almost imperceptibly as the depth changes below. A line of birds moving purposefully toward the southwest as the afternoon light begins to fade. All of it speaking. All of it, to the right ears, perfectly clear. The North Atlantic geography made this approach particularly well suited to the Viking routes. The major destinations of Viking Atlantic exploration, Iceland, Greenland, the coast of North America, all sit at roughly known latitudes. Iceland is at approximately 65 degrees north. The southern tip of Greenland is at around 60 degrees north. The Norse settlement at Lance Aux Meadows in Newfoundland is at around 51 degrees north. A Viking navigator who could identify these latitudes, who had learned, from experience and instruction, what the elevation of the North Star looked like at each of these destinations, had the essential knowledge needed to find them by latitude sailing. They would sail to the appropriate latitude, and then run east or west along it, watching for the signs of land that the birds and the watercolor and the clouds would eventually provide. The Viking sagas contain what appear to be descriptions of exactly this approach. Instructions for reaching Greenland from Norway, for example, specify sailing due west from a particular point on the Norwegian coast and maintaining a specific latitude throughout the crossing. The instructions do not use the language of modern navigation, of course, but the underlying logic of latitude sailing is unmistakable. It is worth pausing to appreciate how this would have worked in practice. Maintaining a consistent latitude across an ocean requires ongoing observation and correction. The wind pushes you north or south. Currents nudge you off track. Storms send you in directions you did not choose. Every deviation needs to be recognized and corrected, which means that the navigator needs to be checking their latitude regularly and adjusting course whenever the check reveals that they have drifted. Checking latitude at night meant watching the North Star and estimating its elevation above the horizon. This could be done with practiced eyes alone. Experienced navigators could estimate angles with surprising accuracy, using nothing more than their hand held at arm's length against the sky, or with simple instruments that gave a slightly more reliable reading. Checking latitude during the day meant observing the sun at its midday peak and judging its elevation. Again, this required knowledge and practice rather than precision instruments. But the knowledge was available, and the practice was continuous. The result was a form of navigation that was robust precisely because it focused on the one thing that could be checked most reliably from environmental observation, latitude, and organized the entire passage around maintaining it. And then there was the seabed. It might seem surprising, in a segment about open ocean navigation, to begin talking about the bottom of the sea. The seabed is, after all, a long way down in the middle of the North Atlantic. Too far down to be sampled, too far down to be relevant to a ship on the surface. But the North Atlantic is not uniformly deep. It has shallow regions, banks and shelves and underwater plateaus where the depth decreases dramatically, where the bottom rises toward the surface, and the character of the water above it changes in ways that a careful observer can detect. And near coastlines, of course, the water becomes shallower still, the bottom approaching the surface in a gradient that a navigator can use to track their approach to land and to identify, with some precision, exactly where on a coastline they are arriving. The tool for sampling the seabed was simple. A plumb bob, a weight attached to a line, with the line marked at intervals so that depth could be estimated. You lower it over the side, you let it sink until it touches the bottom, you note the depth, and you bring it back up. And when you bring it back up, the weight itself carries information. Whatever is on the bottom of the sea, sand, gravel, mud, shell, rock, tends to stick to the weight, particularly if the weight has been prepared with some sticky substance to help it collect material. What comes up on that weight is a sample of the seabed. And the seabed, it turns out, is not uniform any more than the water above it is. Different regions have different characteristic bottom compositions. Some areas are sandy. Others are gravelly. Some have a particular kind of shell. Others have a distinctive mud. And an experienced navigator who knew the seafloor characteristics of the waters they were sailing could use a seabed sample. Its depth, its texture, its composition, to confirm their position with a precision that surface observation alone could not always provide. Some accounts suggest that the taste and smell of the seabed material could also be informative. Different sediments have different characters, some more organic, some more mineral, and a navigator with enough experience of particular waters might distinguish between them by these qualities, as well as by texture and appearance. This sounds, perhaps, like an extreme form of local knowledge. And it was. It was the product of many crossings of the same waters, many samplings of the same seafloor, a gradual building up of familiarity with the underwater geography of the North Atlantic that complemented and confirmed the navigator's knowledge of its surface and sky. Taken together, these three approaches, dead reckoning, latitude sailing, and seabed sampling, represent something important about the overall character of Viking navigation. Each one addressed a different aspect of the navigational problem. Dead reckoning tracked continuous movement, maintaining a running estimate of position based on direction, speed, and time. Latitude sailing simplified the problem by focusing on the one coordinate that could be checked most reliably. Seabed sampling provided a periodic, concrete check against the underlying geography of the ocean floor, a reality check that could confirm or correct the estimates produced by the other methods. Together, they gave a Viking navigator multiple, partially independent lines of evidence about where they were and where they were going. When those lines of evidence agreed, the navigator could proceed with confidence. When they disagreed, the disagreement itself was information, a signal that something needed to be checked more carefully, that a correction might be needed, that the situation deserved closer attention. This is how good navigation works. Not as a single method, applied mechanically, but as a collection of approaches, used together and checked against each other, with judgment applied to the whole picture rather than any individual reading. There is something meditative about the image of dead reckoning, as it must have been practiced on a Viking longship. A navigator at the stern, or at the prow, holding in their mind a continuous, unfolding picture of the journey so far. The distance covered, the direction maintained, the deviations corrected, and the ones that perhaps were not corrected quite in time. The ongoing calculation, never quite settled, never quite finished, always provisional, always open to revision as new information arrived. It is a form of sustained attention that has something almost contemplative about it. Not the narrow, focused attention of someone staring at a single instrument, but the broad, open, continuous attention of someone holding an entire environment in mind at once, watching for anything that might update or refine their understanding. The journey was always in progress. The picture was always incomplete. And the skill of the navigator lay in working, patiently and intelligently, with that incompleteness, in making the best possible decisions from the best possible understanding, and remaining always ready to learn something new. In our next segment, we will look at the knowledge itself, at how it was stored and passed on, how the accumulated wisdom of generations of Viking navigators was organized and transmitted in a world without written charts or formal schools of navigation. For now, though, rest with the image of the journey in motion. The ship moving steadily through dark water. The navigator tracking, in their mind, the long thread of the passage, where it began, how far it has come, where it is going. The plumb bob going over the side in the shallows, near an approaching coast, coming back up with a small piece of the seafloor clinging to it. Everything accounted for. Everything attended to. The journey continuing. History leaves traces. Not always the traces we would choose, if we could choose. Not always the complete, well-preserved, unambiguous evidence that would allow us to answer every question with confidence. The past is, by its nature, fragmentary, worn down by time, scattered by circumstance, filtered through the judgments of those who decided what was worth keeping and what was not. What survives is a partial record, a set of clues, rather than a complete picture. But sometimes, among those fragments, something turns up that is quietly extraordinary. Something small enough to hold in your hands. Something that has waited, in the ground or under the sea, or in the careful storage of a museum collection, for the right person to look at it closely enough to understand what it is. And when that understanding arrives, it has the particular quality of a door opening. A sudden, clear view into a world that had previously been glimpsed only through fog. The fragment we are going to talk about in this segment is one of those things. It is a small piece of carved wood. It was found in Greenland. And what it appears to be, and what careful scientific analysis has suggested about how it worked, tells us something about Viking navigation that is, by any reasonable assessment, remarkable. The artifact was discovered at a Norse site in Greenland, one of the settlements established by Viking colonists during the period of North Atlantic expansion that followed Eric the Red's voyages in the late 10th century. The site is known as Unartic, after the fjord in which it is located, and it was excavated in the early 20th century. Among the many objects recovered from the site was a small, roughly semicircular piece of wood, carved with a series of notches along its curved edge, and marked with lines that clearly had some functional purpose. For many years, the object was noted, but not fully understood. It sat in the category of interesting but uncertain, something that was evidently made with care and intention, but whose specific function was not immediately obvious. Then researchers began to look at it more carefully. And the more carefully they looked, the more it appeared to be something quite specific. A sun compass. Or rather, a fragment of one, roughly half of what would have been a complete circular disk, broken at some point in its long history and preserved, partially, in the archaeological record. The interpretation is not without its complexities. Archaeology rarely offers the clean, unambiguous answers that we might hope for, and the identification of the Unartic artifact as a sun compass has been debated and refined over the years since it was first proposed. But the physical evidence supports the interpretation in ways that are difficult to dismiss. The notches along the curved edge of the fragment are evenly and carefully spaced. The lines carved into the face of the disc are consistent with the kind of markings that would be needed to read a shadow cast by a central pin or gnomon. The overall geometry of the object, when reconstructed into its probable original complete form, produces something that looks and functions like a navigational instrument. Researchers who have built working reconstructions based on the artifact have been able to use those reconstructions to extract directional information from the sun. Not as a thought experiment, not as a theoretical exercise, but as a practical demonstration, holding the reconstructed instrument in conditions similar to those a Viking navigator would have encountered, and testing how accurately it performed. And this is where the results become genuinely striking. Under appropriate conditions of sunlight, on clear days, with the sun visible and the instrument held correctly, the reconstructed sun compass was capable of pointing to true north with a margin of error that, in the best conditions, was very small indeed. True north, it is worth pausing to note, is not the same thing as magnetic north. This distinction matters because it is sometimes used to suggest that the absence of a magnetic compass was less significant for Viking navigators than it might initially appear. The magnetic compass, after all, does not point to true north. It points to magnetic north, which is offset from the geographic pole by a variable amount that changes depending on where you are in the world and shifts slowly over time. A navigator using a magnetic compass still needs to know and apply this correction to get true directional information. A sun compass, used correctly, does not have this problem. It points to true north directly, without any need for correction. In this specific respect, it is actually a more accurate instrument than a magnetic compass. The implication is significant. A Viking navigator, using a well-made and properly calibrated sun compass, on a clear day, was not simply making a rough estimate of direction. They were, under the right conditions, obtaining directional information that was genuinely precise enough to be compared favorably with what a magnetic compass would later provide, and in some respects better. Precise enough, in fact, to navigate. This might seem like an obvious conclusion. We already knew that the Vikings navigated successfully, so their instruments must have been precise enough to support that navigation. But there is a difference between knowing that something worked, in general terms, and being able to demonstrate, through physical testing of actual artifacts, how well it worked and why. The Unartic fragment, and the research it has inspired, provides exactly that kind of demonstration. It moves the conversation about Viking navigational precision out of the realm of inference and into the realm of evidence. It allows us to say, with more confidence than we could previously have mustered, here is an object. Here is how it worked. Here is how accurate it was under tested conditions. And the answer to that last question is more accurate than many people would have expected. There is something important to say about the phrase, under the right conditions. It appears in most careful descriptions of the sun compass's performance, and it is not a caveat to be glossed over. The sun compass required the sun to be visible. It required the instrument to be held correctly, which on a moving ship in any kind of sea state was not a trivial requirement. It required the user to understand the instrument, to know how to read the shadow, how to correct for the time of year, how to interpret what the instrument was telling them. These conditions were not always met. The North Atlantic is not always clear. A ship at sea is not a stable platform, and the knowledge required to use the instrument correctly was not universally distributed. It was the possession of experienced navigators, people who had learned the technique over years of practice, and who understood not just the mechanics of the instrument, but the broader context of knowledge within which it was embedded. What the testing of the sun compass demonstrates, then, is not that Viking navigation was always and in all conditions highly precise. It demonstrates something more nuanced, and ultimately more interesting, that when conditions allowed, and in the hands of a skilled user, the methods available to Viking navigators were capable of a level of accuracy that is genuinely impressive. Precision, in navigation, is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. The end is arriving where you intended to arrive, finding the island, making the harbour, completing the crossing safely. And precision matters for that end because imprecision accumulates. A small error in direction, maintained over days of sailing, becomes a large error in position. A navigator who is consistently a few degrees off course will, over a long passage, end up somewhere quite different from where they intended to be. The sun compass, used well, reduced that accumulation of error. It gave the navigator a reliable, repeatable way of checking their heading against true north, of confirming that the course they were steering was the course they intended to steer, or of identifying that they had drifted and needed to correct. In the context of a crossing from Norway to Iceland, or from Iceland to Greenland, this mattered enormously. These are not short passages. They unfold over days, sometimes weeks. Every day, without a reliable heading check, is another day in which small errors can compound. The ability to check your bearing against a well-made sun compass, on the clear days that punctuated even the most difficult North Atlantic crossings, was not a minor convenience. It was a significant navigational asset. It is also worth reflecting on what the making of such an instrument implies. The Unartic fragment was not crudely made. The notches along its edge are regular and deliberate. The carving shows skill and care. This was not something knocked together quickly from whatever materials were at hand. It was a crafted object, made by someone who understood what it needed to do and had the skill to make it do that thing. That means that behind the artifact, there was knowledge. Someone knew what a sun compass needed to look like, and how it needed to be calibrated, in order to function accurately. Someone understood the geometry, perhaps not in the formal mathematical language that we would use today, but in the practical, embodied sense of knowing what to make and how to make it. And that knowledge did not appear from nowhere. It was built up, over time, through the combination of astronomical observation, practical experimentation, and the accumulation of navigational experience that characterized the Viking engagement with the North Atlantic. The sun compass was not a sudden invention. It was an expression of a body of knowledge, a piece of technology that emerged from and was supported by a sophisticated understanding of how the sun moved through the sky and how that movement could be used to determine direction. There is a quiet pleasure in thinking about this. We live in an era of extraordinary technological precision. Our navigational instruments, the GPS systems in our phones and vehicles, are accurate to within a matter of meters. They are connected to networks of satellites orbiting the Earth, updated continuously, essentially infallible under normal conditions. Against this backdrop, a carved wooden disc might seem like a primitive thing, something to be admired for its ingenuity, perhaps, but not to be taken entirely seriously as a precision instrument. But precision is always relative to context. A margin of error that would be unacceptable in a modern surgical robot might be entirely adequate for navigating a ship across an ocean. The question is not whether the sun compass was perfect, but whether it was good enough, whether it provided the level of accuracy needed to accomplish the task it was designed to support. And the answer, as the research makes clear, is yes. Under the right conditions, in the hands of a skilled user, the Viking sun compass was good enough. Good enough to find Iceland. Good enough to find Greenland. Good enough to support the extraordinary network of transoceanic voyaging that the Vikings maintained across the North Atlantic for centuries. A small piece of carved wood, and within it, evidence of something that took generations of careful observation, accumulated knowledge, and practical ingenuity to produce. It is worth saying, too, that the Unartic fragment is only one piece of the physical evidence. It is the most discussed and most scientifically analyzed. But it is not alone. Other archaeological finds, crystal fragments that may be sunstones, objects whose function is still being debated, traces of navigational practice embedded in the material record of Norse settlements across the North Atlantic, all contribute to a picture that is slowly becoming clearer. Not complete. The picture is not complete, and may never be fully complete. Too much has been lost. Too much was carried in minds and oral traditions that did not survive the centuries. But with each new analysis, each new piece of careful scientific work applied to the material that does survive, the outline becomes a little sharper. And what that sharpening outline shows is consistent. It shows navigators who were serious, skilled, and capable of precision, who made and used instruments that worked, who crossed one of the world's most demanding oceans repeatedly and successfully, not by accident and not by luck, but by applying knowledge and technique that was, within the context of its time, genuinely sophisticated. The fragment sits in a museum now. Small, partial, darkened by the centuries it spent in the ground. Most visitors, if they encountered it without context, might pass it by without a second glance. But it is, in its quiet way, a remarkable object. It is a piece of evidence that someone, more than 1,000 years ago, understood the sky well enough to build a tool that could find true north from a shadow. That they built it carefully, with skill and knowledge. That they carried it aboard a ship and used it on the open ocean. And that it worked. The margin of error was small. The craftsmanship was deliberate. The knowledge behind it was real. Precision, earned the hard way, over generations. And preserved, against all the odds, in a fragment of carved wood found in the Greenlandic soil. There is a quiet pleasure in thinking about this. We live in an era of extraordinary technological precision. Our navigational instruments, the GPS systems in our phones and vehicles, are accurate to within a matter of meters. They are connected to networks of satellites orbiting the Earth, updated continuously, essentially infallible under normal conditions. Against this backdrop, a carved wooden disc might seem like a primitive thing. Something to be admired for its ingenuity, perhaps, but not to be taken entirely seriously as a precision instrument. But precision is always relative to context. A margin of error that would be unacceptable in a modern surgical robot might be entirely adequate for navigating a ship across an ocean. The question is not whether the sun compass was perfect, but whether it was good enough, whether it provided the level of accuracy needed to accomplish the task it was designed to support. And the answer, as the research makes clear, is yes. Under the right conditions, in the hands of a skilled user, the Viking sun compass was good enough. Good enough to find Iceland. Good enough to find Greenland. Good enough to support the extraordinary network of transoceanic voyaging that the Vikings maintained across the North Atlantic for centuries. A small piece of carved wood, and within it, evidence of something that took generations of careful observation, accumulated knowledge, and practical ingenuity to produce. It is worth saying, too, that the Unitic fragment is only one piece of the physical evidence. It is the most discussed and most scientifically analyzed, but it is not alone. Other archaeological finds, crystal fragments that may be sunstones, objects whose function is still being debated, traces of navigational practice embedded in the material record of Norse settlements across the North Atlantic, all contribute to a picture that is slowly becoming clearer. Not complete. The picture is not complete, and may never be fully complete. Too much has been lost. Too much was carried in minds and oral traditions that did not survive the centuries. But with each new analysis, each new piece of careful scientific work applied to the material that does survive, the outline becomes a little sharper. And what that sharpening outline shows is consistent. It shows navigators who were serious, skilled, and capable of precision, who made and used instruments that worked, who crossed one of the world's most demanding oceans repeatedly and successfully, not by accident and not by luck, but by applying knowledge and technique that was, within the context of its time, genuinely sophisticated. The fragment sits in a museum now. Small, partial, darkened by the centuries it spent in the ground. Most visitors, if they encountered it without context, might pass it by without a second glance. But it is, in its quiet way, a remarkable object. It is a piece of evidence that someone, more than 1,000 years ago, understood the sky well enough to build a tool that could find true north from a shadow. That they built it carefully, with skill and knowledge. That they carried it aboard a ship and used it on the open ocean. And that it worked. The margin of error was small. The craftsmanship was deliberate. The knowledge behind it was real. Precision, earned the hard way, over generations. And preserved, against all the odds, in a fragment of carved wood found in the Greenlandic soil. Every journey has an end. Not an ending in the dramatic sense. Not a sudden stop, a sharp conclusion, a final word that closes everything off cleanly. But a place where the forward motion settles. Where the ship, after its long passage through open water, finds a coast and follows it slowly in toward shelter. Where the sail comes down, and the oars take over, and the crew, quiet with the particular tiredness of people who have been fully alive for a long time, brings the vessel to rest. We have been on a long passage in these segments. We have moved through the sky and the sea and the accumulated knowledge of a people who spent centuries learning to read the natural world with extraordinary fluency. We have looked at the sun and the stars, at crystals and carved wood, at the color of water and the flight of birds and the feel of the ocean swell beneath a hull. We have tried to understand, as best we can from this distance, what it meant to navigate the North Atlantic without the instruments that modern seafarers take for granted. And now we have arrived at the place where all of that comes together, where the individual techniques and tools and bodies of knowledge resolve into a single, larger picture. The legacy of Viking navigation. It is tempting, when we reach the end of a story like this, to look for a single thing to hold on to. A central insight, a defining achievement, a neat summary that captures everything in a few words. But the legacy of Viking navigation resists that kind of simplification. It is not one thing. It is many things woven together, a system, as we have said throughout these segments, rather than a single method. And the full weight of what that system represented only becomes visible when you step back and look at it whole. What the Vikings built, over the centuries of their engagement with the North Atlantic, was something that had never quite existed before in quite that form. A comprehensive, deeply integrated body of knowledge about how to move through one of the world's most demanding maritime environments, built not from formal science, not from written texts or institutional learning, but from the patient accumulation of observation and experience, and the transmission of that accumulated wisdom from one generation to the next. Sky, sea, and experience. Those three things, held together, formed a system that was capable of extraordinary things. The sky gave direction and latitude, the sun tracing its arc from east to west, the North Star sitting steady above the pole, its elevation telling a practiced eye exactly how far north they were, the patterns of twilight at dawn and dusk, the polarization of scattered light, readable through a crystal of Iceland's spar, even when the sun itself was hidden. The sky was a constant companion, offering, to those who knew how to ask, a continuous stream of positional and directional information. The sea gave texture and context, the long, deep swells reflecting the history of the weather in distant parts of the ocean, the color of the water shifting as the depth changed below, the temperature at the surface telling a story about the currents beneath, the birds flying purposefully toward land as evening approached, the whales and marine life distributed across the ocean according to patterns that a knowledgeable navigator could read, the seabed itself, sampled at depth with a weighted line, offering confirmation of position through the texture and character of what it yielded. And experience gave meaning to all of it. Without experience, without the years of careful observation, the accumulated lessons of many crossings, the inherited knowledge of generations of sailors who had learned the same waters before, neither the sky nor the sea could be properly read. The natural world was always speaking. Experience was what allowed you to understand what it was saying. Together, these things made possible something that still has the power to stop you if you let it. A longship leaving the coast of Norway. The familiar land falling away behind. The open Atlantic opening ahead, grey and vast and indifferent to the small vessel moving through it. And aboard that vessel, a navigator holding in their mind a complete picture of the journey. The latitude they needed to maintain, the direction they needed to steer, the environmental cues they needed to watch for, the signs that would tell them, eventually, that land was near. And then, days or weeks later, depending on the winds and the weather and the length of the crossing, land. A dark line on the horizon, barely distinguishable at first from cloud, growing slowly more definite as the ship drew closer. The birds more numerous now, flying with purpose. The water changed in color and character. The cliffs of Iceland, or the ice-fringed coast of Greenland, or the low, wooded shores of a continent that no European map had yet recorded. They had done it again, as they had done it before, and as they would do it again. Not by luck, not by instinct, by knowledge and skill, and the sustained, patient reading of a world that was, to those who understood it, legible. The precision they achieved within this system was real. We have seen the evidence for this. The Unarctic Sun Compass fragment, demonstrating that a well-made instrument could find true north with a small margin of error under clear conditions. The mathematical modeling of latitude sailing, showing that the technique could deliver positional accuracy sufficient to find relatively small islands in a very large ocean. The scientific testing of Iceland's spar crystals, confirming that sunstones could locate the sun's position behind cloud cover with meaningful accuracy. The sagas, which describe navigational methods that align, often surprisingly closely, with what the physical and scientific evidence independently suggests. None of this amounts to perfection. Viking navigation was not infallible. Voyages went wrong. Ships were lost. The North Atlantic has always extracted a cost from those who challenge it, and it did so in the Viking Age as it does today. But the system worked. It worked well enough to sustain centuries of transoceanic travel, well enough to find and colonize Iceland, to establish settlements in Greenland, to reach the coast of North America and return from it with an account of what had been found there. By any reasonable measure, that is a remarkable achievement. There is a question that often arises at this point in discussions of traditional navigation. A question about what was lost and whether it matters. Because most of what the Vikings knew, in the detailed, practical, embodied sense, is gone. The oral traditions that carried navigational knowledge from generation to generation did not survive intact. The specific techniques, the precise calibrations, the accumulated local knowledge of particular stretches of ocean, much of it dissolved over the centuries, as the Norse settlements contracted and the great age of North Atlantic Viking voyaging came to its end. What we have recovered, through archaeology and historical analysis and scientific investigation, is a reconstruction, partial, careful, and genuinely illuminating, but still a reconstruction. We do not know everything. We may never know everything. The complete picture of how Viking navigation worked in all its detail is probably beyond our reach. And yet what we do know is enough to understand something important. Enough to recognize that these were not simple people doing a simple thing. They were sophisticated practitioners of a sophisticated system. A system that drew on deep knowledge of astronomy, oceanography, meteorology, and ecology long before those words existed or those disciplines had been formalized. They understood the natural world in ways that most modern people, surrounded by instruments and screens and the products of 3 centuries of scientific revolution, have largely forgotten how to access. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in relationship, in the sustained, attentive engagement between a person and an environment over a long period of time. It is not the same as book knowledge or instrument knowledge. It does not produce the same kind of precision, but it produces something else, a fluency, a sensitivity, an ability to be present in an environment and to understand what it is telling you, that has its own kind of depth and its own kind of value. The Viking navigators had that knowledge. They had earned it, in the most literal sense, through years of time at sea, through the willingness to pay attention, through the patient accumulation of experience, and the honest reckoning with what that experience taught them. And they passed it on. Not perfectly, not completely, not in ways that have all survived to the present day. But enough of it survived, in the sagas and the artifacts and the patterns that careful modern analysis can still detect, to give us a meaningful sense of what it was. To allow us to recognize it for what it was. Not guesswork. Not luck. Not the vague, romantic navigation of people simply hoping for the best in a large and dangerous ocean. But a system. A real, working, sophisticated system, built from the most fundamental materials available. The light of the sun and the stars, the movement of the water, the behaviour of living things, the feel of the wind, and the accumulated wisdom of people who had been paying attention for a very long time. The North Atlantic is still there. The same ocean, the same latitudes, the same prevailing winds and deep swells. The sun still traces its arc from east to west each day. Polaris still sits above the pole at night, steady and unwavering, at an elevation above the horizon that tells you, if you know how to read it, exactly how far north you are. Iceland's spar crystals can still be found, still polarize light, still perform the same optical trick that may have helped Viking navigators find the sun behind the clouds. The natural world has not changed. What has changed is our relationship to it, our attentiveness to it, our willingness, or ability, to read it in the way that the Vikings read it, fluidly, continuously, as a matter of course rather than as a special effort. That relationship is not entirely lost. There are still people, in various parts of the world, who practice forms of traditional navigation, who read the stars and the swells and the birds with something of the same fluency that the Vikings brought to the North Atlantic. And in academic and scientific circles, there is a growing appreciation for what these traditional systems of knowledge represent, not as curiosities, but as genuine intellectual achievements, worthy of study and respect. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of Viking navigation is not a technique, or a tool, or even a body of knowledge. It is a demonstration, a proof, written in the historical record, of what becomes possible when human beings commit themselves fully to understanding the world they live in. The Vikings did not cross the North Atlantic because they had better instruments than everyone else. They did not do it because they were braver, or stronger, or more reckless. They did it because they paid attention, because they learned, because they built, patiently and collectively, over generations, a way of understanding the natural world that was deep enough and reliable enough to carry them across one of the world's great oceans and back again. That is the legacy. Not just the voyages themselves, remarkable as they were, but the quality of attention that made the voyages possible. The understanding that the natural world, looked at carefully enough and long enough, becomes a kind of guide. That the sky and the sea and the living things between them are not simply backdrop, not simply scenery, but a continuous, legible text, available to be read by those willing to put in the time and the effort to learn its language. The longship is at rest now. The sail is down. The oars are shipped. The crew has gone ashore, to warmth and shelter and the solid, unmoving ground of a coast they found because they knew how to find it. The vessel sits low in the calm water of a harbour, rocking gently with the last of the swell, its wood dark and salt-stained from the crossing. Above it, the stars are coming out. Polaris first, as always, steady above the pole, just where it should be. Then the others, spreading slowly across the darkening sky in the patterns that any sailor worth their salt could read as easily as a familiar face. The ocean lies quiet in the darkness beyond the harbour mouth, vast and patient and full, as always, of information, for those who know how to listen. They knew how to listen. And that, in the end, is the whole of the story.